Hey, welcome to the video. So today I'm going to be talking about Resident Evil 4 VR, but in two different forms. So I'm going to be discussing the difference between the Quest version and the PlayStation VR 2 version. I'm going to be discussing some of the differences, and then we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of each. And then you can decide for yourself which one you want to play if you haven't played either of them before, or you can argue with me in the comments if you don't agree. Now for this video I'm going to talk about mostly the VR elements of the games. Obviously Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 4 Remake as games themselves, there's a vast amount of difference between them. Some of the obvious stuff is, there was 15-16 years between them, so the graphics in Resident Evil 4 Remake are going to be leaps ahead. Same with the audio design, same with the gameplay. It's using the new RE Remake engine. Now both games have been built with VR in mind, so the Quest version was built specifically for the Oculus Quest or the Meta Quest, and they did say when they made the game that they had to rebuild a lot of the original assets for the VR version because it didn't translate exactly. Some of the assets were blurry or pixelated, or it just didn't translate very well, so they had to actually rebuild a lot of the assets. But it is the original designs, it is the original environments, and everything else runs the same. It's almost identical to the flat screen version. And in the PlayStation VR 2 version, they built the game with VR in mind, being released as a later DLC. So they knew when they were designing the game that they had to implement these elements. And that, I think, came off the success of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village VR. They knew it would be a hit and they promised us that it would come. So some of the things I wanted to talk about that are noticeable differences whilst playing VR on these two separate platforms. I'm going to treat them almost as if they are different games and compare them that way, but also drawing on the similarities. So the first thing I want to talk about is your introduction to Ingrid Hunnigan and the way your radio works. Now the way Hunnigan's introduced in the game is completely different on each of the platforms. In Resident Evil 4 VR on the Quest, we're introduced to Ingrid Hunnigan through ways of the radio that Leon has, and you can see her face, and then the subtitles come on as well, and we just answer a call, and then we start talking to her, and that starts the relationship with Hunnigan, and that engages it that way. But on the remake, we see a visual representation of her in the form of a cutscene. We see her come in, but then throughout the rest of the playthrough, she just sort of comes up as a subtitle with an icon. So it doesn't interrupt the gameplay, although you can't do certain things while the radio is playing. What I liked about the Quest version is that you can skip dialogue by simply tapping on her face on the radio, and you can sort of skip the dialogue. You can also move it closer to your ear, and you'll hear the sound in different areas. And it just feels a little bit more immersive. Although the screen goes sort of dark and black and white whilst you're on the radio, so you can't really go anywhere or do anything, it's more immersive having that radio there and being able to tap, which I thought was a cool concept. So that was Ingrid, and although she is, yes, a small part of the story, she's integral to moving the plot forward. So I feel like it's a good place to start in terms of the comparisons, because the way they deal with Ingrid is slightly different in each of the games, as I mentioned. And the reason I think it's like that in the remake is because that's what it's like on the flat screen. So the remake is actually VR mode implemented inside of a flat screen game, whereas the VR mode on the MetaQuest version is a rebuild of the game for VR. So they were able to implement scenes that we didn't get. Now, I don't see any reason why they couldn't have done that in the VR mode on Resident Evil 4 Remake, but it would have taken extra time to implement features like that. The VR mode that we got for Resident Evil 4 on the MetaQuest took years to build. So I'm happy with seeing Ingrid in a cutscene or in the subtitles for the sake of getting the game quicker, because the game is amazing, and having some additional features with the walkie-talkie and stuff wouldn't be a major selling point for me, wouldn't make or break it. So to the next talking point, that first encounter with a villager for Leon, which is monumental to the game. In any Resident Evil game, the first monster or enemy that you face is always very cinematic, it's always very intense, and it's always very intentional, the build up to it. So there's some key differences in the way that Resident Evil 4 Original and Resident Evil 4 Remake tackled this encounter and built up that suspense. So you can see from the moment of opening that first building door to the moment we deal with the villager, we realise that he's hostile, and then to actually eliminating the hostile. We sort of deal with it in the same length of time, but we operate it on a slightly different level. In the original, Leon sees him much quicker after a brief encounter, and then you get the choice to actually shoot him, and we realise that he's not going to stop. In the remake, you have to make your way through the house. You do that at your own pace. You can go into another room first, and then when you see the villager, you try and talk to him in Spanish, and then you realise that once you found the badge, he's trying to kill you. And then that whole thing is a cutscene in itself, and Leon sort of kicks him into a wall, breaks his neck, and then you don't see him again until you go later on into the basement. But that's how the scene plays out. So they do tackle it slightly different, which I thought was interesting. But as always, the delivery of both is absolutely excellent. The one in the original Resident Evil 4 reminds me heavily of Resident Evil 2, when they first encounter the zombies and they're sort of holding their gun out and saying, you know, freeze, don't stop. And the zombie keeps coming. And it's sort of like that. And that's what it reminds me of. And that's why that bit was so nostalgic to me, as always. I'm a massive Resident Evil fan, and that was amazing to see that. And then the fact that you can go and shoot the gun out of his hand and the axe out of his hands and things, it's fantastic. But then you get that sweet kick in the remake, and then the actual fight when you see him coming down the stairs and his head's all mutated. It's super cool. It's also very frightening in VR. So the thing about the VR version is you really do, and this goes for the Quest and the PlayStation VR 2 version, you will notice things that you never noticed before playing the flat screen game. Even if we're talking about the Resident Evil 4 for the Quest, where you know the attention to detail isn't as great as the remake, you'll notice things. Whether it's a bowl of maggoty broth, or a decaying animal on the side of the road, or to a secret passageway that you never saw before that you maybe can't enter but you can see through it now, or you can see through cracks in the door, or you can see out in the distance and you'll see different buildings and landmarks, and you'll just notice things. It could be water dropping off a ceiling. You'll notice things that you never noticed before, and that's what brings Resident Evil to life in VR, is noticing those little details, and just make sure you stop and take them all in. Okay, so back onto the game and combat. Anyone who's played Resident Evil 4, whatever shape or format, will tell you that the moment you get into the main village, where they're sort of having that bonfire with the policeman, is one of the most intense and terrifying moments of the game. And that can be said about the original, the remake, the Wii version, the toaster version, the kettle version, the iPhone version, whatever version you're playing. That moment is terrifying. And more specifically, the first time you encounter the Chainsaw Man. Now, it goes without saying that in the remake, he looks more terrifying, and he just charges at you a lot more menacingly. And actually seeing him sticking his chainsaw in the door, trying to cut it open like a Jedi. Now, in both versions, it's bad, but you do also get the opportunity to use some of Leon's melee attacks. If you manage to stun him for whatever reason, whether you've used a flash grenade or if you've hit him with maybe a close range shotgun blast or something, you'll get the option to melee him. And in both games, the melee works pretty much the same, in that it takes you out of the VR experience and brings you into a third-person view of Leon spin kicking or suplexing or whatever you're doing to the enemy. Now, the bonus on the PlayStation VR 2 version is you can use your knife to deflect the chainsaw or any other melee weapons that are coming your way. Whether someone's throwing an axe or hit you with a pitchfork, you can deflect that with your knife and then counter and slash them, and that is all entirely in VR. You have full control over your knife, even to the point where you can wiggle it with the trigger. Now, while we're talking about knives, the knife play in Resident Evil 4 on the PlayStation VR 2 is far superior to any other knife play I've experienced in any other VR game. So on the original, on the Quest, your knife is basically stuck to your body. You pull it off your chest, you can throw it anywhere you like, and it'll just reappear in its holster. You can pick it up and you can slash any which way but loose, but mostly you can't stab, it has to contact like a slash. And then you can sort of spam it. You can destroy barrels and things with it, but it's by no way a substitute for a gun. It's not very powerful. You can't upgrade it, I don't recall. Whereas the knife in the PlayStation VR 2 version, you can spin to hold it, downwards, upwards. You can stab someone in the eye if you want to. You can deflect obstacles that are flying towards you. You can deflect chainsaws if you do it right. You can deflect pitchforks. You can stab things. You can also do executions. So you hold the trigger and you sort of do this stabby motion towards an enemy that has the symbol above their head, and then you'll perform an execution. Or you can even do it in a stealthy way. It encourages stealth. So you can sneak up behind an enemy and stab them in the throat. Now, the knives do break. They have durability attributes on them, but that adds to the survival element. So that's one of the things I would probably give to the PlayStation VR 2 version, is the knife play is just absolutely fantastic. Okay, so moving on to QuickTime events, which is everyone's favourite word. Now, I've played Resident Evil 4 on just about any console you can name, and the problem that Resident Evil 4 had, what they thought, it seemed to be a thing at the time, even Resident Evil 5 did it to some extent, is QuickTime events. And that did translate somewhat to the VR version. So on the Quest version, I wouldn't exactly call them QuickTime events, but they are VR QuickTime events that prompt you to do a certain action to avoid certain circumstances. So for example, the boulder scenario, when it falls, on the VR version, you have to flick them up, I think, or press a button. There's an activity you've got to do. PlayStation VR 2 version, it does prompt you to click a button to dodge, but I think you can also just move out the way. That's what I did. Now, when an enemy grabs you, on the PlayStation VR 2, you've just got to mesh the X button, and you can sort of wriggle them off, give them a swift elbow, or you can pull your knife out and do an execution, which I think is pretty cool. On the Quest version, you've got to wiggle your arms like you're trying to sprint, and then he'll do the same shoulder press. So depending on what you're into, if you're into more of the physical quick time events, then the Quest version is probably better for you. If you don't want any of that business, then the PlayStation VR 2 version is probably for you. Now moving on to the merchant. So good news is the merchant is existing in both versions of the game, and he is pretty much identical. The only difference is in the merchant his introduction. You sort of see him in a slightly different area, in a slightly different circumstance. He still gives you objectives. You're still able to buy, sell, tune up, upgrades, and he still gives you objectives based on blue medallions and things. But now in the Resident Evil 4 Remake on the PlayStation VR 2 version, there is additional objectives that you can do, such as killing mice and finding snakes and things. There's also another feature now in the PlayStation VR 2 version of the Remake, which is called trading, and you collect spinels, which were available in the original game, but all you did with them at the time was sell. Now you can use them to exchange for things like yellow herbs, recipes, treasure maps, so it's pretty cool. And the inventory management system is almost identical in both games, where you have the attaché case, which you can increase in size through the merchant. You can maneuver things around, play a game of Tetris if you like. But in the Remake, there is an additional crafting option now. So now you can craft items using gunpowder and resources, and you can make different types of ammo, which is actually really cool and really useful. It adds to that survival horror element. I know some people like it and some people hate it. What are your thoughts? Okay, so there we go. Those are some of the things that I wanted to talk about between the Quest version and the PlayStation VR 2 version. Some of the key differences are things like the graphics, how many things are interactable. All of the cutscenes in the games appear on like a theater screen. That happens in both PlayStation version and the Meta Quest version. Some of the pros that I like about the Quest version are that you get mercenaries included. That's not included on the PlayStation version. You have your mobility, given that you're playing it on the Quest, you can take it anywhere you like, and there's no cable, so you can move around freely. As I mentioned, the radio situation, the radio is much more immersive and much more of its own character in the Quest version. Your knife doesn't break in the Quest version, so it's always there as a last resort, and it's just a bit more silly. If you're up for a laugh, Salazar in particular is quite funny. And then some of the pros to the PlayStation version, the knife is completely insane in how much fun you can have with it and how it makes you feel. You get different kitchen knives, combat knives, you can upgrade them, and they really are a tool to be reckoned with. Another pro of the PlayStation VR 2 one is the graphics and the attention to detail is just insane. It's like being in the world. It's like stepping in to the world of Resident Evil. You actually feel like you're in the village. All the different sound effects, the 3D audio, all the different minute details that you'll see, flies, heat coming off flames, everything just makes you feel like you've been transported there. The gunplay is another thing on Resident Evil 2 on the PlayStation VR, utilising the haptics in the headset and on the controls themselves. You feel every gunshot. A gust of wind might go by and you'll feel it in your face. It's absolutely fantastic. Moving on to cons. So cons of the Quest: limited graphic ability due to the MetaQuest, meaning sometimes everything just looks brown in the Quest version, but it did on the GameCube. So, I mean, it's true to life, but if you're sensitive to just brown colours, then that's going to be a major con for you. The knife isn't as great as it should be. You have to be very precise with these slashes for it to actually work. You can't just stab. You can't throw it. I mean, you can throw it, but it'll just float back and not hurt anyone. Cons of the PlayStation VR 2 version: you've got the cable, you've got no mercenaries. Everything does seem quite dark, but it builds to the atmosphere, and none of the other DLCs work, which I wish that we'll get them in the future. Maybe the DLCs for Separate Ways and the Mercenaries, and then maybe even Resident Evil 2 one day. Who knows? But anyway, those are my thoughts on the Resident Evil 4 VR for Quest for PlayStation VR 2. Let me know what you think. Is there anything I've missed that's worth talking about? What are your thoughts? Have you tried both of them? Which is your favourite? Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.